give it a warm welcome for Ayush.
Hey, well, thank you very much. I'm just going to talk to you about hybrid apps and a better way to kind of go about them. So let's just dive in. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to start with what's a hybrid app, so start right at the basics so we're on the same page. They seem to get quite a bad rap in the tech industry. People don't seem to like them. We'll talk about why this has happened and why it may not quite be accurate. What is turbo native? So I've been talking about, like I mentioned it in the title slide as well, that it's a better way to go about hybrid apps. So what is it? Why does it help? And what's the correct approach to get them right? Because it's quite easy to get this wrong. Before we start, allow me to be a bit of a narcissist. A bit about me, that's like my avatar on all my socials that you'll see. I'm not quite that rock and roll in real life, but I'm allowed to exaggerate because it's the internet. I'm from London. I'm a freelancer, so I kind of specialize in web development, mainly with Ruby and Rails. That's my business website. I co-host a podcast because, well, who doesn't have a podcast these days? It's called Just a Spec. It's about web specifications and standards that kind of drive the modern internet, which I promise is a lot more interesting than it sounds. You'll find that on all good podcast platforms, probably some of the bad ones as well. I'm on the core team of Bridgetown. If you're unfamiliar with it, it started life as a fork of Jekyll. But it's kind of grown into a lot more than that. We don't even call it a static site generator. We call it a progressive site generator because it can do so much more than just generate a static site. So if you've ever kind of been frustrated with Jekyll and how it's kind of frozen in time, I'd highly recommend that. And I also run an app called Scattergun. It's kind of on pause these days because I've got a lot of other shit on. But yeah, that is one of the many things that I kind of have going on. I've also written a book, which I'm going to shamelessly plug on an entire slide. Basically, all the code samples and most of the content of today's talk has been extracted from this book. If you're looking to level up with Rails and Hotwire, it's my completely 100% unbiased opinion that this is the best resource out there. Of course, I would say that. But anyway, enough about me. Let's dive in. So what's a hybrid app? A hybrid app is one that combines web technologies like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript with native APIs on iOS and Android. The degree to which these two worlds collide, it kind of depends on what tools you use. These are a couple of popular mainstream tools, Cordova, which used to be called PhoneGap, and React Native. These are kind of like the tools most people would kind of reach for when you say hybrid apps. We'll come back to these a bit later on, but for now, let's take a rather sizable detour into the Chinese hills, where there was once a monastery where a distinguished Taoist guru lived with his disciples. Every evening, the monks would gather in the Great Hall to listen to their leader's teachings and to meditate. But there was a problem. There was a stray cat that had adopted the monastery as its home. And every evening, it would follow the monks into the Great Hall, and where it would mewl, it would scratch, and it would just generally be annoying throughout their silent meditation. And after a while, the teacher got pretty fed up of this, and he ordered the monks to put a collar on the cat and tether it to the far side of the monastery every evening. Now, this worked well for a while. For a while, the teacher, the monks, the cat, they all went about their nightly routine, and everything was fine. Until one day, the learned teacher died. But the monks, they continued to tie up the cat every evening. More years passed. Eventually, the cat died. So what the monks did was they went down to the nearest village, they bought a replacement cat, and they tied that up every evening instead. 2 centuries later, religious scholars write learned essays on the importance of tying up a cat prior to evening meditation. This is an ancient Buddhist tale known as the tale of the tethered cat. And it serves to explain principles that have outlived the conditions that created them. Now, tech loves a tethered cat. This is my personal favorite. Sure, it sounds familiar to a lot of you. I think the notion that hybrid apps are bad is another tethered cat. It's just something that got established, and people have stopped questioning why this may be the case. Is just an established fact. Over the years, I've heard so many falsehoods about hybrid apps. Things like hybrid apps are slow, hybrid apps don't look native, and even hybrid apps are insecure. I don't know how that one came about, but it's all stuff I've heard. And I just got thinking, how did these falsehoods get so ingrained in our industry? And I started thinking back, and one of the starting points that I thought was here's one thing. Mark Zuckerberg in 2012 said, the biggest mistake we've made as a company is betting on HTML5 over native. Now, Facebook rewrote their hybrid app around that time and then shouted about it a lot. And, if Mark Zuckerberg says it, it must be true, right? So I think it just got really ingrained in the industry, and people just said, okay, Facebook can't do it, then hybrid apps are just a failed concept. They just don't work. We're going to go fully native, and that's the end of that. The other thing was that the two mainstream tools that I mentioned earlier, Cordova and React Native, they both operate on the philosophy that you have one shared code base between the two platforms. Now, that doesn't work. That has never worked. That will never work. Does anyone remember Java apps? You do, yeah. Yeah, they were rubbish one. They're how many of you have an Electron app that you absolutely love? Yeah, this concept of shared code base is it doesn't really work. Yeah, same thing with Flash. That's another great example. And on top of that, Cordova also kind of builds out your entire app's UI in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So the UI basically looks quite almost the same on iOS and Android, which again is not very good because platform standards differ between the two. And if you want to give your users a good native-esque user experience, you kind of want to have at least some platform standards being followed in your app's UI. React Native, well, I don't want this talk to turn into a rant. I think Nigeria made a really good case against React yesterday, and React Native isn't much better, to be honest. But I'm just going to show you what the former lead developer of React Native used to have on his Twitter bio. So partly to blame for React Native, sorry. I mean, that says more than I ever could about that tool. So I think between Mark Zuckerberg's 11-year-old take on the tech and the two mainstream tools being quite insufficient, I think we established a textbook tethered cat here. But before we look at why these presumptions may not be valid in 2023, let's take another detour. If I can get the bottle open. This time we're going into the English countryside. It's a little closer. There once was a man who had a long way to walk to work. And every day he would have to go well out of his way because there was a large hedge that blocked the most direct route. So every day he would walk a mile longer in the morning and then back home in the evening. And he would think that if that hedge wasn't there, I could save myself an hour of walking every day. And eventually he just had enough. And he's like, I'm going to make a hole in this hedge so I can walk the most direct route. So he did that, and that was the day that the bull that lived on the other side of the hedge killed him. How a Texas Longhorn bull found its way in the English countryside, I'll leave up to your imagination. It's fiction. Let's just roll with it. This is a tale that was established by a British writer and philosopher called G.K. Chesterton. It's known as Chesterton's fence. And he used it to explain the principle that we shouldn't remove a rule before fully understanding why it was first put into place and all the effects that its presence has. So let's look at some of the circumstances around this myth that hybrid apps are bad being established. So if we look again at Mark Zuckerberg's quote, that was from 2012, which is 11 years ago. The world of mobile JavaScript performance is like in a different league compared to where it was back then. Like, I found an old iPhone 6 lying in my drawer, and I ran a speedometer test on it, and I got a score of 24.8. Then I ran the same speedometer test on my current phone, which is an iPhone 13 mini, and I got a score of 349. In, what is that, 7 years? Yeah, 7 years, that's the performance jump. That is just ridiculous. I mean, I don't even have words to describe what a performance jump that is. Like, and okay, granted, we're looking at a $600 top-of-the-line phone with that score of 349. But when I saw the score, I texted a few friends and family who had Android phones, and I said, can you run this test and tell me what score you get? And these are not scientific numbers, obviously, because it's just anecdotal, but I'm still getting scores of like between 60 to 100 on all current Android phones. So we're still looking at like about a 3x improvement on a phone from 2014. I think that proves that the performance level of mobile devices now is just completely different to what it was 11 years ago. And maybe it's time to revisit this idea of hybrid apps. Maybe the tech is there now that we can build them and deliver a really good user experience through this technology. So let's reconsider it and talk about when we should go hybrid, because shock and horror, they're not a silver bullet. It's not something you would do every single time. You would go with a hybrid approach, I think, when the beating heart of your app is a server-rendered web app that speaks HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Ideally, you'd use one of these full-stack frameworks or something similar to kind of drive that, but it's not necessary. As long as the primary focus of your web app is HTML and CSS, that's when hybrid makes the most sense. If you're building something like an Uber, which is like deep native integration because you need like maps and location and that kind of stuff, and you don't really need a web app, then hybrid's not really the right approach. That's when you would want to invest in a fully native app. So what are the advantages of this hybrid approach? Well, I think the biggest one is we can reuse HTML, CSS, and JavaScript from the web app. So you can reuse all your views from the web app in the native app. This is a huge competitive advantage because if you're a small team, then building every view 3 times is just a massive overhead and probably impossible. For solo developers, it is impossible. There's no way you're delivering an app on 3 platforms where you have to rebuild every single view again. So that's like a huge competitive advantage if you could just reuse those views in a good way. Because it's hybrid, we still have one foot firmly in native land. So native APIs like push notifications, contacts, maps, etc. You still have access to all of that. You can still make use of all of that when you need them. So it kind of gives you the best of both worlds up to a point. And this is a cool advantage as well. You can push updates remotely by just updating the web app. Now, obviously, it's kind of limited in what you can do with this because some stuff just needs native code. But you'd be surprised that after you get up to a level of stability with your native code, you can do quite a lot by just doing web app deploys and pushing new features. And you don't have to go through this app review process and hope that someone at Apple and Android's review team isn't having a bad day and rejects your app for no good reason, because that does happen. Okay, enough preamble. Let's talk about how we can do this. Well, the first thing is separate code bases. I said earlier, shared code bases don't work. Separate code base, use Xcode, use Android Studio. We build a fully native skeleton of the app. And in that skeleton, we render web content. So this is kind of what it looks like. So you would have your navigation bar, your tab bar, like the core backbone of the app will be native. So you're not going to get away from writing native code. We got to write at least some. But the actual content of the screen, we just render as web content. It's just HTML and CSS, the same thing that your web browser would deliver. And so yeah, app, in a way, it kind of becomes a custom web browser. And this is where Turbo Native comes into the equation, and this is where it helps. So what is it? Well, it's part of the Hotwire suite of tools, which is an open source front-end stack from 37 Signals. And it's made up of 3 parts. The first part is Turbo, which is a successor to Turbo Links, which if you've worked with Rails for any number of years, you might be familiar with. Turbo Native is kind of part of that umbrella. It extends Turbo on the web, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The second part is Stimulus, which is a purely front-end library, where it allows you to attach pieces of JavaScript logic in the form of controllers to your HTML elements. So it's just a very lightweight way to kind of just add JavaScript logic to your HTML page. And the third part is Strada, which released last week and completely scuppered the final part of my talk. Wait 3 years for that library and then release it 1 week before I'm giving a talk. I'm kidding. We will talk about it a little bit. I'm not going to cover it because I haven't actually had a chance to look into it deeply. So I'll talk about it, but I'm not going to look quite closely at that. But let's look at Turbo Native. So it's a native library for iOS and Android. It's written in Swift on iOS and Kotlin on Android. Conceptually, they're almost identical, but from an implementation point of view, they're quite different because it follows platform standards. The way you write code in Swift and the way you write code in Kotlin is different. The platform APIs and design patterns, they vary. So that kind of goes back to my earlier point where you shouldn't share a code base. You should respect the platform you're on. And to me, this library does that because even though conceptually it's the same, the implementation is based on the way you would write code for that particular platform. And it extends Turbo on the web, specifically Turbo Drive, which is another subset of Turbo, which is basically a natural successor to Turbo Links, because Turbo does a whole lot more as well. If you're not familiar with Turbo, I just want to talk about what it does, so we're all on the same page. So Turbo on the web, it's pretty non-intrusive. It kind of installs itself on your web app, and then when you click a link, instead of just navigating to that link, Turbo will intercept the call, and it'll make a fetch request to the destination. It'll get the response, and then it'll just swap out the body element with the response. And it also uses the push state API to update the URL, so your back button and forward button in your browser still works. So how does Turbo Native augment this kind of flow? Well, the first thing is when Turbo Native loads a page for the first time in your app, it will install itself as an adapter on its web counterpart. So how does it do that? Well, both iOS and Android have native APIs that let you communicate with JavaScript and vice versa. So if you have a web view in your app, you can literally using native code communicate with it both ways using native code, which is really cool. So that's what Turbo uses to install itself as an adapter. So that lets it kind of place itself right in the middle of Turbo's request cycle. So now, when you tap a link in your Turbo Native app, instead of making a fetch request, what it does is it calls a native method instead. Now, in this native method, you can make a decision. You can either proceed with the default navigation, or you can present a fully native screen instead. I love this approach because it means you're never all in on either hybrid or fully native. You can build out certain screens in your app fully natively if you want, leaving the rest to be just web views. So if you have one screen in your app where the user spends 90% of their time, you might want to build that one out fully natively just so it's the highest level of fidelity possible, and the user gets the best experience on that screen. But all the other screens that are not used that frequently, you can just leave them as web views because you don't need that extra bit for those. So I really like this kind of approach because it kind of brings this concept of progressive enhancement to native apps as well. Let's zoom into what is this default navigation that Turbo Native gives us. Well, when you tap a link, the first thing that'll do is it'll create a new native screen. If you're familiar with any native APIs on iOS, that would be a view controller, and on Android, that would be a fragment. The next thing it'll do is it'll inject the web view into this new native screen. And finally, it'll tell Turbo to navigate to the destination, and it'll present the new screen to the user. This is really cool because it reuses the same instance of the web view across all the screens. So you get all the performance benefits that you would with Turbo. And from a user's point of view, this is just a seamless native transition. Like, let me show you a video. So, I mean, to me, that looks pretty native. All like the stuff like swipe to go back on iOS and things like that, they just work because we're just using native navigation. So all that stuff we just get out of the box for free. Now, some of you may have noticed that fully native login button. This is a hybrid app. Now, until about a week ago, it was more of a mystery how we did that. But then Strada came out, and it was like, yeah, that's basically the point of Strada, is that it lets you place fully native elements, but it's kind of still driven by a web app. So we're not going to dig into how Strada actually works. We're going to go one level deeper and talk about the tech on which Strada is built, which is the web-to-native bridge. So I mentioned earlier that Turbo uses native APIs to install itself as Turbo native uses native APIs to install itself as an adapter on its web counterpart. So we can use the same APIs to do whatever we want as well. So like on iOS, you can post messages to the native code. So that's JavaScript just posting a JSON message, which will trigger this Swift method. And here we can send whatever message we want. We can do whatever we want with it, and do something in native code with this message received from our web app. Android has the same APIs. It looks slightly different, where we just need to declare a method as a JavaScript interface, and then we can call that method from JavaScript. So it's slightly different conceptually, but it basically accomplishes the same thing, that we can send messages from web to native code. And we can go the other way as well. So in Swift, you can just evaluate some JavaScript in a web view, and you can do the exact same thing on Android as well. So this is really powerful because now we have two-way communication between native code and our web app. So we can have our web app tell the native app to do certain things, like place that fully native button. So how would we go about doing that? Well, we'd create an actual HTML element which would act like a proxy for that native element. So this is how I'd do it without Strada. I mean, Strada would clean some of this up, but this is kind of going down a level. You just have a simple link. You'd attach a stimulus controller to it, which I've called bridge element, which we'll see on the next slide. And then just some data attributes that kind of tell the platform what to do with it. So in this case, I've just specified the kind of component that it should render. And this is what the stimulus controller looks like. So when this controller is connected to the DOM, the connect method is called. And the first thing we do is we'll add an invisible class, because we don't want this to be seen in the web UI. And then to render it, we'll just create a bridge element instance with this element. I don't want to go too much into what bridge element actually is. It's just a simple wrapper that kind of encapsulates those data attributes that I showed you on the previous slide. And it also uses a meta attribute on the document to determine which platform it's running on. So it's just some encapsulation of basic logic around that stuff. And then the web bridge is a construct that uses the adapter pattern to call the correct API to send messages to the native app. Because, like I said, the code differs slightly on Swift and Kotlin. So it just uses an adapter pattern to determine which API to call to send the message. So yeah, that's basically what we're doing. We just create a bridge element, and then we post a message using the web bridge to native code. And then in native code, we can do whatever we want. So we just receive that message like, oh, okay, we want to render a native button. We write some native code that renders this button. And to handle a click on that button, Well, this would be click handler. We just locate that bridge element that we created in the web app, and then just click it using JavaScript. Same thing on Android. So the native button is nothing but just a pretty front end for something that's actually taking place in the web app. And it's all driven from the web app itself. Like you're not like once you have your logic in place to receive certain messages and your app knows what to do with them, you can just drive this stuff with your web app. You don't really need to write additional native code to do any of this. So let's take a look at what this kind of logic looks like in action. So that's a fully native button triggering a web action. So that modal presentation is just a configuration in Turbo Native. You can set how you want certain parts to be presented. So that's got nothing to do with this component. But yeah, fully native button that's triggering a web action, which I think is really cool. So let's just recap what the web to native bridge is. You can pass messages from JavaScript to native code and vice versa. You can render fully native web components, fully native components which trigger web actions. Basically, you're not limited to buttons or anything like that. You can do whatever you want. You can dream it, you can build it, because it's just a generic message passing bridge. You can do with it whatever you want. Strata is just a thin abstraction layer on top of this. It standardizes a lot of stuff around these messages being passed, certain kind of components that can be rendered and stuff like that. It just makes a lot of the stuff less fiddly. I haven't had a chance to dig into it too deeply yet, but I think it's good to understand how this bridge works, because I think very often we'll find ourselves going down a level to the bridge to just do some advanced stuff, maybe stuff that Strata doesn't support or may not support. Anyway, so to wrap up, let's address the big burning question. Is the experience as good as a fully native app? No, sorry, just isn't. We can get pretty close, but it's not as good, but I feel it's good enough. Because I think after a point, you just get diminishing returns. Like your hybrid app can get quite far, and then to get that extra little bit of fidelity with a native app, you would have to probably spend like an order of magnitude more money to kind of build everything natively. And is it worth it? I'm not sure. In most cases, I'd argue probably not, because most apps are CRUD apps. As much as we may hate to admit it, I think most web apps are CRUD apps. And I think the hybrid approach works perfectly in that scenario. And I cannot emphasize enough that the consumer doesn't care. The app could be written in Swift, Kotlin, or fucking assembly for all they care. Like, it doesn't matter. As long as the consumer is able to do what they opened your app to do easily and without like errors and stuff like that, they're going to be happy. I think a couple of obvious examples to prove this are here in Basecamp. These are the flag bearers for Turbo Native. You can see they both have 4.6 ratings on the App Store, very happy customers. I think a slightly unexpected example would be, I think, BBC Sport. It's a hybrid app. It doesn't use Turbo Native, as far as I'm aware, but it's the exact same philosophy of having native navigation and then web content within it. If you don't believe me, go to any BBC Sport URL and add .app at the end of it. You'll get the version which is served to the app. And look at that 4.7 rating. If we compare that to a highly popular, fully native app, I don't think my dislike for Facebook has been at all evident in this talk. I think I've just glossed over that very smoothly. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is it's possible to build a fully native app that's substandard. It's also possible to build a hybrid app that's delightful. Thank you.